Hello, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good evening from wherever you are in the world joining us. We're really happy to have you here today at the Warning Research Seminar. We are looking today at the wonderful book, Science from the Future, A Philosophy to Warnings, or of Warnings, by Santiago Zabala, who is with us today. So we're really delighted to have you, Santiago. Thank you. As you can see,
Hey,
I've got lots of post-it notes in, so I found
well,
it
thank you.
an
Thank you.
absolutely fascinating read. So first of all, I'll just start off with a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll give a little bit of a bio of our author and also why we feel this is such an important event in relation to warnings and for the Warning Research Centre. And then I'll hand over to Santiago so he can take us through some of the key elements of the book. And then if anyone has any questions, please do pop them in the chat at the end or during, but we will address those after the talk. So please pop any questions you have in the chat. So the event will be recorded and available online. So we are really delighted to have you here today, Santiago. So Santiago is an ICREA research philosopher, researcher, a philosopher, professor of philosophy at the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. And he's an author of a number of different books and has written a number of opinion articles and publications that stretch across the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and the Los Angeles Reviews of Books. So we are in very wonderful company. So thank you very much for joining us today, Santiago. The reason we really wanted to have Santiago come and talk to us is because this is such an important topic, and the book really cuts through some of the many challenges that we talk about in the warning world. And that is really that our greatest emergency has become the absence of emergency, which I think really sums it up very beautifully. And also the idea that the truth or even science is not enough to be considered being warned. And I thought it was really interesting. There's a lovely section at the end of the book here, which I hope you don't mind me just reading a little bit here, which I think is just very accessible. I am not a philosopher, but I found the book very easy to follow and very engaging. And I've got a huge reading list, which is fortunate that Christmas is coming up, so I can ask Santa Claus for some of those. But at the end of the book, Santiago focuses on Greta Thunberg here and her work on environmentalism. And he states that this choice is not made simply because of the success of her activism with the public, as opposed to the warnings from scientists working on global warming, but also because she incarnates a different form of hermeneutical knowledge that displays a different relationship with reality than what we are accustomed to. This knowledge reveals that facts, evidence, and truth, particularly those related to climate change, are insufficient impetus to make us listen to warnings. If they were enough, the first conference on the human environment in 1972 in Stockholm would not have been a failure. So these are really wonderful points here, really, about how the science really doesn't stack up. And the book really goes through the philosophy of warnings, the how we ignore them, and how we can be warned, which is a really important point. And I was very pleased to see that there was reference to the Netflix film Don't Look Up, which some people jest about, but I think it is a really wonderful popular cultural reference to this key issue of, we've become so sort of ignorant of reality and what that means. And this book's very good at exploring some of the dynamics that we talk around about warnings being objective, seen as a truth, or whether they're subjective, so they're interpreted and how they're interpreted by people. The challenges of languages as well. So there's some lovely examples in French of l'avenir, which is unpredictable, versus la future, which is predicting based on the past and the present ideas. So it's the idea that we have this word, but different languages have different ways of framing the way that we look at warnings and forecasting. And the book does a really great job of kind of breaking out the differences between what's a sign, what's a warning, what's an alert, and so on. So I think this is a wonderful book. And I'm going to hand it over to Santiago to take us through it. But I have certainly learned a lot, and I think that it is absolutely pivotal to the conversation about warnings to take Santiago's work, extensive work covering many, many philosophers over a very extensive period of time, his perspective on warnings and how we can incorporate that into enhancing warnings for our everyday life. So Santiago, thank you so much for joining, and I will hand over to you now.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me or hosting this book event, which of course I'm honored. I apologize not being in London, but I promise to come in the future, or maybe for further discussion of on the book or other topics. Which I know that your center has been working on this for a very long time, and doing my research for the book, I have followed many of the webinars and publications you do. And but of course, this is a book, unfortunately, by a philosopher, and as most philosophers, we're sort of useless. Or we cannot be as useful as some of the social scientists working on themes like warnings. But we try, or I try, because there are not a lot of philosophers that actually talk about a philosophy of warning, or even warning from a philosophical point of view. So why this book? Why did I come to write this book, and why am I happy with it for now? At least there's one review has come out that was pretty nice to me. In order to explain why or what I mean by warning, which is something different from what most of you understand by warnings, and by you I mean the research center. Which is not that my understanding of warning is better, or it's just different. It's just from a very different perspective, which of course it can be also very useful for a dialogue that we can have, that I hope will now begin between us. So you mentioned at the beginning this idea of emergencies, of what an emergency is. And in my previous two books, I work a lot on this notion that comes from some philosophers I studied, Heidegger, Agamben, and many others. And the basic idea, I think, that we find ourselves today in a condition where our greatest emergencies, now I said greatest, I didn't say the only. So our greatest emergencies are the ones which are absent. In other words, that we're not really confronting them. And those are the real important ones. Those are the ones that we should really be discussing, and most of all, engaging in them. So the very simple example that, and you mentioned Don't Look Up, which is a funny movie, but it works, I think, very well from that point of view, because an emergency, just as the one they talk about in the movie, is one example. And of course, climate change works even better for this, that it's not really, we don't really discuss it. We discuss it maybe, but we wouldn't do a lot of research on it, but we do not confront it. We do not confront it as we're supposed to confront it. So, but of course, there are many other emergencies similar to that one, which are also as, I would say, even as dangerous. I could think of many things that are going on, from, well, we can see what the same genocide in Palestine recently that has not really been confronted to, or even also the war in Ukraine. At the end, the United Nations is not really doing anything there, so it's allowing that emergency to continue. In other words, we're not confronting it. And of course, there are many, many levels that we could discuss, and the amount of emergencies that are absent from our politicians are not confronting it's very big. What does this mean from a philosophical point of view? Well, I think that, or how can we explain that? So one of the many ways I think we can explain that is through this notion of absence of emergency. In other words, how did we reach to this level? How did we get here? How did we get to the point that we treated the COVID pandemic, which was definitely an emergency, and I'm glad we sort of confronted it, but we did not confront, for example, the quality of the air, pollution, which is responsible for even more deaths every year than what the pandemic was. It's sort of an Owen Jones had a nice column on that in the Guardian during the pandemic. So my concern, so why are we in a situation in a condition where these emergencies do not emerge? So if we look at this century, in other words, it's been 25 years, it's brand new. There's something we can note. There's something we can find out if we look, for example, at the three biggest events. So 9/11, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and we can even use the pandemic, but there are, or yeah, let's use the pandemic. Well, if we look carefully, after 9/11, there was an intensification of the wars in the Middle East. In other words, there was even an occupation, if you remember. In other words, there wasn't a real change. There was a continuation of what was going on before. Financial crisis also. Banks were saved, and we have returned to the same situation in which we were before. In other words, the problem was not fixed, at any level at all. And in the pandemic also, during the pandemic, I remember everyone, in part myself included, were all hoping for, let's return to normality, let's return to like life was before. But that was, of course, the only thing we were not supposed to do. That's specifically what we're not supposed to do, is return to the same situation, because it is very likely we will have another pandemic one of these days. It's quite likely, actually. It would be a surprise if we don't. What does this mean? This means that this century is one of the characteristics of this century is the absence of emergency. In other words, that we have all the information we want, and we even have very good information and scientists that give us very precise. And even the pandemic was something that we were warned about for years and years. I mean, anyone who researched a little bit about that specific virus, well, it was a matter of time. It wasn't such a big news. So the idea that we don't really have big news, in other words, that we actually can more or less predict or warn, and there's a difference between the two I will discuss now, implies that we live in a century now where, in the book, I call this the global return to order through realism. In other words, there is a global return to order, which, except in Spain here, I don't know why, but we're still holding up. And but it's what sort of return is it? It's a return to realism. And realism, which is a very tricky word in the philosophical tradition, but in general also, because right, we want to discuss reality. Yeah, sure, but reality is a problem. In particular, if we discuss issues like warnings, because the great problem we have today is one of transparency. And there are a lot of philosophers that have discussed this, of course, but the problem we have is particularly the idea that we believe, or some of us think that, well, we can know things, we can know reality. So, for example, I can know what the COVID vaccine is made of. Well, it might be a good idea that I don't do that research because I don't have the tools. I'm a philosopher, so my PhD was German philosopher. I'm not qualified for that. But I can find online specifically and find out what it's about, what the vaccine is actually made of. Well, this is a problem because this transferring, this excessive transferring we have now, allows us also to move away from warnings. In other words, to distrust warnings, or from a political point of view, to have a distrust in the establishments, and of course in those that have the authority to talk about those things. Right? So this is all something that there are a lot of people now that that self-medicate, for example, right? They go online and they find out how they're supposed to cure some illness they have. So that's a very big problem because, of course, every drug is particularly made for each of one. We can have different reaction to different drugs. So the idea of transparency, that we can actually get to find out things and actually have the information there, it's a problem rather than something that we should be cherishing. An example of this is, for example, what happens with, I'm sure you all remember those whistleblowers, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and many others. It's curious to look at how their findings, right, that were very real. I mean, there were documents there, it's pretty clear. It wasn't open up for interpretation. And I'm sort of a specialist in hermeneutics philosophy, which is interpretation. So it wasn't really open to interpretation. I mean, those documents were there. And if we read those documents or that event, and we look at what happens with climate scientists, that they tell us their findings, and they tell us specifically their findings, it is curious to note that nothing really changes in both occasions. How come? I mean, after Julian Assange revelation, I mean, many politicians should have gone to jail. And also we have there the data of the consequences of climate change. So, but nothing happens there. What does all this mean for the research that I did and for this book that I wrote? Which, of course, I am leaving here aside a lot of the philosophy because, well, I'm a little bit bored with it now, because I think it's, for the discussion, it's easier to talk about it. But we can go into it afterwards. But why is this interesting for me? It is interesting because it points out that, like you mentioned before, Karina, that, well, science is not enough. Truth is not enough. No, it is not enough. We are not going to get very far simply with the objective result that climate change is an issue that we are all. That is not enough for change to take place. Sort of postmodern philosophy that basically accept anything, any philosophy, any point of view, which is a very complex concept, postmodernity. And I do think we have to return to that. But because postmodernity, if we look at carefully at postmodern philosophers, they never claim, I'm talking about François Lyotard, Derrida, and so many others, they never claimed that there wasn't any truth. They never claimed that. If you read carefully, even Bauman, they never claimed that. What they claim and what they warn us about, and I discuss this in the book, is that we have to be very careful with the concept of truth, with the concept of even of transparency, because those are often the ones that, the problem. I mean, what postmodernity wanted was for us to be careful not to fall back into some sort of totalitarian regime founded on what? Founded on truth, on one specific truth. I mean, democracy works because if it works, it doesn't always work. But when it works because, well, it has a sort of a flexibility there that one can change things, right, every 4 years, and things don't really change, but they could change, and et cetera, et cetera. So the point here is to understand that what is our responsibility, or why should we be discussing the problem of war? And why are warnings so important, as I claim they are, and why I actually believe that philosophy is a sort of warning. I mean, philosophers talk about the death of God. They talk about, about so many, as you know, so many concepts which are very big questions, right? Basically, philosophy, what it does, or at least a good philosophy, what we do is we try to find out what is the most important question. And the most important questions, most of the times, are the ones we cannot answer. In other words, the one that is almost impossible to answer. That's why it's a good question, because it allows us to return to it, right? And try to and by returning to this big question, we often also return to ourselves. In other words, to perhaps not repeating the same errors in history. So I claim that the biggest questions of this 21st century is, why don't we listen to warning? So here the problem comes with listening. There's a big distinction, of course, between hearing and listening, right? I hope now you are listening to me, not hearing me, because you would be hearing me, you wouldn't really be that interested, and I apologize if that's the case. But the idea is that we have to return, we have to start again to listen. And what does listening mean? Because listening has a very long philosophical tradition, and philosophy has, for the most part, discarded the problem of listening for speech. There's a whole kind of thought there about logocentrism, and which I won't go into it now. But the issue here is listening. We don't listen to warning. It is curious that we tend to listen more to predictions. Predictions are different from warnings, right? And I know that you have studied this. And in the book, I give a very simple distinction between warnings and prediction, referring to the problem of the future. Like Karina said, there's a difference between the future, which is something that predictions deal with. Tomorrow it will rain or whatever. And of course, warnings, which is different. Warnings have more to do with a different sort of future. The future that in French they call l'avenir, which in English it has been translated for something that to come, right? Now, the distinction between the two is very important. It is vital because we have now constructed in some way a society where if we listen to prediction, right? We want to make sure that what we are told will happen. The problem is that when we're discussing predictions, there's something missing. Because when I go to my physicians and he tells me that, you know what, you don't have to stop drinking, Santiago, because your liver has failed already. So that's it, and whatever will happen next. So that would be a situation of the future, right? It doesn't really give me an alternative. I am stuck with the liver I have, and bad luck. But often, I hope most of the time for all of you, we go to a physician and he tells us, you know what, I'm going to warn you. If you don't stop drinking or you don't start taking care of yourself, something will happen. Now, where is this warning directed to? This warning is directed to an alteration that you're supposed to enact now, in the present. Right? So warnings are really calls for an alteration of the present, of what is happening now. In other words, to that normality that I mentioned before when we talked about the pandemic. So the problem is that we return to that normality. In other words, that we do not listen to the pressure, right, the intensity of a warning. It is curious that often we listen to our physicians, not necessarily when they are very serious and look at us with anger or worry, but when someone close to us get ill, right? If you have your brother that gets ill and you suddenly start to, it's different. The warning becomes something different at that point, right? We normally take care of ourselves when someone close to us gets sick or has been warned. So this distinction is important because this is a warning, as far as I am concerned, it's a call to an action now, but it's an action devoted to what? Devoted for a different future, right? For a prediction that is not the one that we are told, but it's one that, in other words, there is hope. The prediction is also a way of telling us that we still have hope, that we still have. This is why Greta Thunberg is sort of hardly anyone knows Stanley Hansen. Well, I'm not saying that it's wrong that we know more about her than about great scientists, but it is curious that her message, right, her pressure, I prefer to say, works better. Right? It works better because from an educational point of view, it tells us that this is not rationality, truth, right? Like I mentioned before, science is not going to do the job. Right? It's not going to do the job. And Naomi Klein has explained this in several of her books that, well, at science gatherings, they often talk more about political activities and activism rather than their findings, because their findings, unfortunately, they don't work anymore. So what is philosophy supposed to do in this situation, right? What does a philosophy of warning do, and what are we supposed to do? And I think that this distinction is important. So one thing is when we talk about being rescued, right? We are being rescued from a fire. We're being rescued from some situation in which we find ourselves, right? And they come and they rescue. Well, I think that philosophy in particular, but art also, and I think also many other social scientists, what they do, and they might not know they're doing this, but I think they are doing this, they are not really rescuing us from one of the situations, but they're rescuing us into them. We're supposed to be rescued into these emergencies, right? We're supposed to be rescued into the warning. We're supposed to be rescued. In other words, we have to get closer to that emergency, that absence emergency that was discussed before. So Anna Arendt, who is a very famous philosopher, I'm sure you all know her and read many of her books, and I devote a whole chapter to her because she's a very clear example of a philosopher that has warned us about so many issues, um, even now the automation of economy. So she's very important. But she used to say that that thinking meant thinking about the invisible. What we're supposed to be when we think properly, right? When we are doing serious philosophical deliberation, we have to try to think what is not there. So this is also the other point I was making about realism. The point is what is not there. That's really what is important, right? And about a warning. What are the ways that we can think about warnings to listen to them? That would be already a big start. And also perhaps to engage with them. In other words, to engage in the alternative that they are presenting to us. Right? Here, there's also an issue of which warning are we supposed to be listening to? Because we might know specifically among famous scientists different options, but in general, the general public, general public more or less they just have to hear who's out there giving the warning, right? And most of the time, these warnings are given by prime ministers, in other words, all the way high up. Now, it is curious that if we look at the far-right populist politicians around the world, almost all of them discard warning. Almost all of them. Trump, that doesn't even believe in climate change, did not even declare the state of exception in the United States. But not only him, even Farage in the UK has dismissed a new organization the United Nations was going to set up after the pandemic in order for coordination of possible pandemics. Why? Because the problem of a politics of warnings, which is how I more or less try to end the book, and the new book I'm writing about is mostly about that. How can we envision a politics of warning? What does that imply? It doesn't imply that we have to have a plan of possible. We have to be prepared to, and I do believe we have to be prepared to everything. I mean, we had actually a blackout here in Spain. I don't know if you remember this summer. There was a day that there was no electricity, and I'm not saying that I was the only one that was prepared for that. I mean, I really wasn't, but I did save all my documents on a hard drive because I knew that the possibility of a blackout is something that it will happen, and it probably happen in a much. But the point is that while we do have to prepare for warnings at an ontic level, and by ontic level I mean that part of what you do in the center, which is vital, but that's not the only way we have to confront warning. We also have to confront warning at an ontological level. In other words, from more of a philosophical point of view. Of course, both work together, and it is difficult to distinguish them as some philosophers would do. I don't like to distinguish them I don't think it's even possible to do that. But so the point here is that how do we rescue the public into this emergency? Well, I think that one way to rescue into them could come from, for example, the practice of visual art. Visual arts can be a very good medium, I think, to point to get us closer to these emergencies, which are not there. Why is it important to look at art, for example? Well, in particular, because politics or politicians, at least let's imagine the good ones. The good politicians have a very hard time nowadays governing or even trying to govern with let's say, a 10-year plan. Right? It is very difficult nowadays for politicians to do that. I'm not saying that they are victims. On the contrary, it's part of the problem. But in this system where everything is a prediction, where we don't really listen to the warning, well, it is very difficult to predict, to do a politics of warning. A politics of warning will imply, of course, that we have to be what? We have to be prepared, of course, to when the emergency comes. But the point here is, and this is sort of the main claim in my book, is that the issue here is that an emergency is not something that, it's not the explosion that is there and you walk away from it. That's not the emergency that I am interested in. I am interested in those emergencies which are in some way ontological. In other words, which are the ones that warnings discuss, because a warning is something also very weak, or at least the announcement of a warning is something weak in comparison to the announcement of a prediction. The announcement of prediction is very clear. I mean, this is going to happen tomorrow. That's it. There's no getting away from it. A warning is, well, you know what? Things could get worse, but maybe they won't. Yes. But a warning implies an alteration which will be good for us. In other words, a warning implies a different worldview, a different perspective. Actually, even I would say a different engagement that we have with the world in some way. And this is why in the book I try to explain many things, but I insist in this idea that many things that many artists, for example, I think they're warning us of things that will happen, that might happen, in such a way that they're trying to involve us in them. So the point of interpretation, because here everything has a lot to do with how we interpret warnings, right? And to tell you the truth, I think that the interpretation of warnings is something very, very difficult. It is not easy to interpret a warning. An interpretation, a description of something, which is basically what happens in predictions, that's quite easy. And it's actually very poor from a theoretical point of view. So tomorrow it would rain. Well, you're not going to get it. There's nothing going on there. But if we discuss of the problem that whether tomorrow is going to rain and the consequences that we have because of the quality of the air, well, then it requires an engagement from us, right? We all have to become some sort of, in some way, almost, I would say, activists. And that engagement implies, most of all, a break with normality, a break with reality, the reality we have become accustomed to. So the goal of the book is not so much to find out what a warning is, which I more or less give some definition to some philosophers, but it's more an invitation to think warnings not as what will happen in the future, but rather whether we will have a future. We might have a future if we listen to warnings, and the problem is that we have all the good warnings. In other words, we have the good establishment, the good scientists. Everything more or less is set up, but we still don't listen to them. And this inability to listen to warnings, I think it's something that we have to continue to confront. And I think it's one of the most important issues, at least from a philosophical point of view. I would say one more thing. I'm sure that some of you have read that there are a lot of, for example, philosophers that work on environmental philosophy. And there are some people that work on plant philosophies or insect philosophy and the animal philosophy even more, for example. I mean, I find it very difficult not to interpret their research as a warning. Right? I mean, they are warning also of the consequences of not taking care of animals, plants, or insects. Right? And we can also use this on other social sciences. Right? So the idea here is to try to rescue us into this absence emergencies, which are nothing else than warning, right? But to also understand with this I want to stop because I will go too far. But the difference between, we have to keep in mind there is a very big difference between the authority, right, that warnings can have, and not to confuse authority with authoritarian, right? And this distinction is very important, I think, because Hans-Georg Gadamer, which is one of the German philosophers I base this book and everything I basically do, he points out that, well, the difference is between authority is someone that, I mean, you can have authority, something that others give you. You can't show up with it. It's something that others give you, right? Oh, he has the authority to talk about Shakespeare because he wrote so many books. An authoritarian doesn't need that, right? An authoritarian would just impose the law that I am the best interpreter, and that's it. Right? This distinction is vital to look at whose warnings are we supposed to listen to, and this is more or less everything I wanted to say. I have more things to say, but I would like to engage them in the questions if there are any.
Brilliant. Thank you, Santi, for taking us through this wonderful overview, but yet in depth about some of the really key issues. And I'm sure, like many of us on the call, we can definitely identify with many of the issues. I know that whether you're talking about a sort of philosophical warning or whether you're talking about trying to get someone to not go out in the storm, there's still this question of why are people not listening? Why are people not taking the action? Why is this message being lost in the noise? And I think, it's a really big question in terms of warnings in practice, but also these sort of, more existential and philosophical risks as well. And I thought it was really interesting actually because you talk about the four riders of the apocalypse, which is IP, supplies of water, food, and raw materials. But I know that there's a lot of talk about AI and all the warnings that are going around at the moment and worries and concerns. It's really hard to sort of cut through that and actually make sense of it because there's so much noise. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that, and then I'll ask another question. But please, if anyone has some questions, and I know we've got some great members of our audience, please do pop them in the chat, and we can ask Santi after he's addressed my couple of questions to get you warmed up.
Right. Well, those four warnings. My concern again is always with the warnings that it's the my issue is also with which are the warnings we're supposed to confront first, and which is the one that has the greatest urgency for us to respond to. Again, everybody, my students often ask me to do a sort of table, a list, and this list, I don't think it's a list that can be vertical. It's just sort of a list that should be horizontal, because warnings. Which warning is Santiago supposed to be concerned with today, right? It doesn't deal perhaps more with my own interest. So it is important that for us, everybody, to choose which warnings they are really supposed to engage with. I don't think it's something that should simply come from, it's environmental. That's the only thing we should think about. Well, it depends, because you might be more inclined to confront the problem of, for example, AI, which is a very interesting issue, very important issue now that I would probably there's probably a lot of discussion about this. I devoted part of a chapter to that, to the fact that everybody was preparing to regulate AI, and there's no way that's going to happen. So I wonder how come we've been warned so much about artificial intelligence, but at the same time nothing really is happening there. So that's another example of a great emergency we have, which is not confronted at all, which is actually ridiculous to a certain point. So again, I tend to think that the warnings we confront are the ones that we should feel closer to. So it could be femicide, which is a plague throughout Europe. It could be something else. But I do think it's important to think in terms of, what is not being confronted? What are we leaving? Why are we even leaving this problem aside? And the problem we have is that we're leaving aside very big problem. We're not talking about one specific issue. For example, I don't know, the one big problem we will have, I'm sure you discussed this in the center, is our lack of response to antibiotics. This is something that is coming, which is it's going to be extremely a very serious problem. Well, it could be that, it could be something else. So I do think that there are many warnings there, and if I have to invite someone to confront one of them, I will invite him to confront the one that he sees that it's more absent from the public domain, from the public discussion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know that you in the book you address some of the really great journalists, John Pilger, who I'm familiar with his work, for example, that has really exposed so many horrific things that have happened, and just people are not listening, even though it's published. He's a well-known journalist, it's quite incredible, really. I wanted to ask you in terms of thinking about questions around warnings. Um, we know that it's not enough, that the science isn't enough. We know that the truth isn't enough. So, what is enough to make a warning? And I'm asking you an important question, which means that you probably, by your own definition, cannot answer it. But that is kind of
Right.
the question, right? Which is, what is enough? How can we make warnings enough?
Of course, I'm not going to answer that, and that's not the idea. But I do have some ideas, some hints as to what we can do there. Um, Also, the idea that what is enough is also dangerous, because I would be very reluctant that there is something that actually works and we can get this over with. Again, because warnings are weak announcement or vague, so they require from us a lot of engagement. But I'm not so sure whether there is something that is enough. But I do know that the warnings that manage to pressure us emotionally, I would even say, are the ones that are more interesting. So I mentioned before, family, someone in your family who gets ill, or loved ones. I think that's one way of invite of trying for helping one. The point here is this: we actually have to help warnings become warnings.
Mm.
Warnings is not something that is just there and, oh, look, let's take it and we have it and it's over with. No, no, that's not the way it works. Warnings is something that we actually have to engage with, we have to understand, and we have to sort of take a certain responsibility of that warning. In other words, it's a warning that probably concerns us. So it is not something that is totally out there. Now, and so this concern, in some way, and this is why I was uh, well, the most important philosophers in Hegel is Martin Heidegger, and he points out that a warning is that being, the concept of being, of existence, can also be interpreted as a warning. And this is something that, of course, for me was revealing to find out in his writing. In other words, he insisted in the fact that, well, existence in a way is a warning, that we have to actually, I mean, we should be from an existential point of view. Let's imagine our children, my 3 months old baby, or our children in general. What's happening there? Are we listening to the warnings that are going to be useful for them or not? And I think that some warnings can come from art. I think that I don't. The point I tried to make at the end of the book is that there aren't. I don't see a big difference between a warning from scientists about climate change and an artist that managed to convey the problem of I don't see a difference there. They're both trying to warn me, right? And if both can work together, or if I can manage as a good interpreter to read them together, all the better. But I wouldn't put there something that makes them enough. I don't think a warning can ever be enough. We need something more. But that something more comes from us. In other words, comes from us from learning to listen properly, learning to listen to what is not there, and engaging in a warning. I think a warning is not something that we intellectually should simply study. No, no, it's an engagement. You actually have to be part of it in some way. That's why I refer to the idea of rescuing ourselves into the emergence.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because certainly from our perspective in the warning research world and in the context of disasters specifically, a lot of work is done around that engagement element in helping people to understand what the warning is, and especially if it's something they don't understand, like they've never been exposed to a volcanic eruption, for example. That's a very kind of common one, like never witnessed this, so I don't know what it's like. People do know what flooding is like generally because they see it on, media all the time. So this idea of
But
engagement is really important. Sorry.
sorry, you made a very good point here. So I didn't experience this, so I don't know what that is. That's where imagination comes in, right? So that's where what I mentioned before about using art. So we also have to have the imagination to picture ourselves in that situation. And maybe that could come from a movie, it could come from a novel, it could come from a work of art. We have to imagine that we can also find ourselves in that situation. And if art in general could push us a little bit in that situation, well, that's all the better. But my concern is that my fear, put it this way, my fear is that think, we need to actually experience the emergency to know what it is. No, we don't. We don't need to experience the emergency to know what it is. We can actually today we can watch them. We can see. I was watching today one of your webinars about the tsunami, 14 years after the tsunami. Well, we can learn from that. For example, I think that's quite a shocking experience. Those images and everything. So we can also participate in this intellectually in some way, I would say, and that is actually also participation. It's also an intervention in some way.
Yeah, I think there's an irony about Don't Look Up, that it's about a meteorite about to hit the Earth. When, you know, one of the most famous disaster movies is Armageddon, with Bruce Willis blowing up an you know, for precisely that reason. So it's kind of like there's almost this sort of irony in that film that they picked that particular hazard, given that huge popular cultural reference. But I know there's a few artists that are on the call, and you know, I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more about what it is about art, because I know from a scientific perspective, and I often find myself at meetings, and I will be told, you know, if we could 100% forecast, predict, you know, what's going to happen, will there be any disasters? And I can categorically say, yes, there will be, because science is only part of the whole situation. Politics with a small p and a big P are a huge part of that, as you've already discussed. So science, in a way, is only part of the story. But what do you think? And I'm curious, because I do a lot of cross-disciplinary work with the arts and humanities myself. What do you think it is about art that has us? It's not in terms of like an answer, but is able to engage with us, or at least try and enlist us in the discussion a little bit better. What do you think is it that it gives warnings that we could perhaps take forward?
Okay, so to respond to this, I have to respond to this through one of my previous books, which has which is titled "Why Only Art Can Save Us," which it's unfortunately a lot of people have bought the book thinking, "Oh my God, this is great," and then they found serious philosophical, for at least for the philosophical tradition that I come from, into philosophy and hermeneutics, and well, art is just one realm, okay, it's one place through which we can understand reality and we can confront even warnings, etc. Science is another one, religion is another one. The difference between them from a philosophical point of view are not that big. The difference we can see between them is simply that, well, in art there seems to be a greater space for artists in general to do more or less to be freer than what we are. In other words, well, we work in a university, we have certain parameters we have to follow, which in part they're good because they pay our salary, and but artists don't have that, right? So it's more of a struggle for them. But that also has a positive side, right? Because they have more freedom, right? And they have more possibilities to experience. And so I think in general, art has more of a possibility to there's more space there for freedom. Now that's one thing. The second thing about art in general, and what do I mean, or what do we mean when we talk about art? In particular, this is the way how I frame the issue. We talk about art as a space, a particular space in which we can be rescued from. Now, if we look at contemporary art, in particular, starting from 1970s, conceptual art, and then we had land art, and then we have a lot of environmental art. And I actually created an exhibition last year where I gathered a lot of artists, and they all exposed some works of art that you can find on my website. And now, it is curious that one of the works of art there that I exposed, that I presented in the exhibition that I chose. First of all, the artists did not really understand, not because they were stupid in no way. It's just that they didn't really see that my exhibition was, the title of the exhibition was The Absence of Emergency, the greatest emergency, the absence of emergency. And each work of art has rescued us in one of these emergencies. These beautiful houses, these houses in the countryside, and they actually put a neon around them, which indicates the level of the water in 2050. And so you could see a very serious environmental issue of the water increasing. During the exhibition in Valencia, not far from here, they had this huge floods, which we had 250 people died there, and was doing the same exhibition. And it was in some way was interesting because it became very clear that what they were doing in their art was a warning of what will happen if we do not confront this issue. So in some way, I think art is closer. It is easier for artists to think in terms of the future, in terms of l'avenir, what is coming to us, right? And we have, and by we, I mean me, but let's say the social sciences in general, we tend to have more trouble in using that imagination or even being that creative in some way, to a certain extent. They don't have that much trouble with that, right? They can more or less do whatever they want, and I think that freedom is very important in order for the warning, to discuss warnings in particular, or the absence of emergency. So that's how I see the idea of art or the practice of art. I find it that it's even Gleisner, his movie The Zone of Interest, he declared that the movie More Than History was actually a warning. It's another clear example of what he was doing. So yeah, I think that it can be very useful if we reinterpret works of art, but also scholarly work like Timothy Schneider, his book on the Holocaust. He also declared that it was more a warning than anything else. Why? Because I think that good scholarship or good art is projected toward l'avenir, is projected toward what is coming. In other words, we have to be capable of listening to what is coming, and that implies also preparing for what is coming. This is why I make this small joke that a lot of people try to find love through Bumble or Tinder or whatever it is, and it's curious that those mechanisms are actually done constructed for you not to find love, because something that it happens, and you have to be careful to listen to whoever is coming towards you. That implies an effort on our part. It doesn't simply imply that it's going to happen. It might not happen. Right?
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Santi. If we haven't got any more questions, I would like to say thank you very much for taking us through the book today and giving your insights. I'm delighted to say that we've got a couple of really exciting projects coming up, working with artists that we'll be talking a lot more over the next year about, and advertising some workshops and things that we'll be working on. So we can build on some of the work that you've done and take those routes as well. We've just had a last question, actually.
Okay.
I will add that in. So a question here from Francesca. I would be curious to know about the language and the usage of the word warning in the Spanish context and in artistic contexts.
In Spanish context, well, I'm not Spanish to begin with. I might have a Spanish name, but I'm not Spanish. I work here just because I got a good job here. But the Spanish language, advertencia. Well, this is a good question. Let me answer this question by I mentioned that we're not listening to warning, right? I mentioned, and I think that your center agrees that we have a serious problem, and probably that's why the center also exists in order for us to start listening to warning. But I think that we find ourselves in a situation that it is it is very alarming, because not only we don't listen to climate change warning, which that is going to have a very serious effects on our life, but I mean we have reached the point that we don't even translate the word warning properly. So in the book, for those of us who read the introduction, you will find that I'm sure you all know Giorgio Agamben, a very famous Italian philosopher who works a lot on state of perception, and he has this small book that he wrote after the pandemic, which is a collection of articles. And in the first chapter, the first sort of presentation of the book is titled in Italian Un'avvertenza, which is the literary translation of that is a warning. And he talks about the problem of biopolitics coming up, everything that has been discussed afterwards with the COVID passport and all that stuff. Now, unfortunately, in English, it has been l'avvertenza has been translated by a forward. A forward. That's not in Italian. There's another word for a forward, una prefazione. So there could be many reasons why this. It could be that, well, from a stylistic point of view, the translator decided that it would work better to write forward, which I don't understand, because the book deals with warnings. So how come that happened? And the book has been translated at first. I think it first came out in Policy, and then in a second different English press. And in both editions, they left this translation. They made a mistake with translation. In other words, they did not listen to Agamben. They did not translate properly the word. So I am a little bit concerned here, because if we have reached a level where we're not translating properly even the word warning, okay, on a book that discusses the problem that we didn't listen to the warning of the pandemic and all the warnings that Agamben has given us about what's happening there, then we have a serious problem with language as well. And this, and I would be quick, I don't want to take more of your time, very kind to invite me. But language for me is also education, right? Language is education in a certain way. So from this point of view, it is curious that Greta Thunberg ceased to go to school. In other words, she ceased to be educated in order to listen to warning, to listen to environmental warning. So a lot of politicians, as you remember, and even today, a lot of people said, oh, no, she should have gone to school. Really? Because it seems that education, or what we stand by some education, is meant for you to not to listen to warning. I know it's a sort of a stretch, but there is something there, because unfortunately, I'm not so sure that that in school we are. I mean, are we of climate change, of the warnings that come with climate change? Apparently, we're not. Otherwise, Greta Thunberg would have continued to go to school, right? And maybe we wouldn't be in the situation in which we are. So, if we to stretch it out, language is also education, and we have a serious problem that we are not really educated. I mean, I don't see how it would be possible to educate without warnings. One education in a certain way is a warning of everything we don't know, right? So everything we still don't know that we learn, and we learn that we don't know. Well, that's what it is, to be careful. And I mean, the more I study philosophy, the more I see I have to study more, right? It happens in all the sciences. So that I think it's something that has to do. I tried to answer. I sort of made a U-turn, but I tried to answer.
Thank you so much. I think, you raised so many great points there. And it's also, I think, in terms of education normalizing, like we often see, students in Japan who are doing their drills for earthquakes, and it becomes it's such a critical part of their education. They bring it every day to what they do. But on the flip side, as you say, there's there's almost a sort of normalization of not asking deeper questions and just accepting knowledge as it is, which is again what you come back to in the book a lot, which is really fascinating. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear that you've got another book in the works. I think the work that you're doing is absolutely critical for the work on warnings, and
Thank
it
you.
is really important that we do take that step back and think about what does this mean and how can we build on the work of different philosophers and way of thinking and understanding to try and piece this together, whether, as you say, it's a long-term existential warning or whether it's something that's going to happen tomorrow. It's all really, really critical for us to get our heads around. So thank you so much for pulling such a wealth of
Thank you. Thank you.
and starting that conversation. And we really hope that we'll be able to continue that. So thank you for your time, Santi. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we will be popping this online so that other people can watch it if you want to watch again or you missed it. So thanks very much for joining us today for
Thank you
our
again.
event. And we will have more events coming up at the Warning Research Centre. So do keep looking out for what we are posting on our YouTube channel. Thanks ever so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.